what I'd like to do this evening is to introduce the second of our Provocations in Transport series. This one is being given by Isabel Dedring. Isabel is ARUP's Global Head of Transport.
Yes.
Yes. And she's also a visiting professor here, and in previous life was heavily involved in the GLA as London's Deputy Mayor for Transport and the Deputy Chair for Transport for London. So just to remind people who were here last time and who weren't, the idea of this series of Provocations in Transport is to present to the world the idea of stuff that you won't hear anywhere else, and to be provocative and challenging, and not necessarily to talk about easy stuff. So I can't think of anybody better to continue the series than Isabel, and that's your challenge.
I think I've changed my mind, yeah. Goodbye. Right, well, it's fantastic to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I can see some very old friends in the audience, so I'm trying to remember whether I've said anything in the slides that isn't strictly true, but I've just been reassured that it's a provocation and it doesn't really matter what I say, so that's fine. Without further ado, I guess really what I can bring to the table in this illustrious audience is, which I mean seriously, it is maybe some real-world experience, having worked at Transport for London for 4 or 5 years and worked at City Hall for 8 years in a political role, but also in a policy-making and delivery assurance role. So, what really happens in the real world when all our brilliant ideas about how this should work sort of come to fruition or not. And I guess my basic premise is that, there's a lot changing in transport, but a lot staying the same, but the opportunities of the changes that are happening are very significant and positive, but maybe a bit different from how I think a lot of people are talking about them at the moment. So the future has arrived. Hold on, I'm going to move over because I don't think you guys are going to be able to see my amazing slides. There we go. There we go. Aha. And, it used to drive us crazy at City Hall, and there's some people here who are still working in the GLA family. People would come and talk to us about smart cities. It's all going to change. It's all going to be amazing now. And they would show us pictures like this, and we would just roll our eyes because, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. We understand that the rise of mobile technology means that there's all these doors that are opening to us in terms of, the opportunities from a policymaking perspective. Obviously, there's new technologies that are much heralded, but there's still only, one of them driving around in various cities. So that's the Google self-driving car. Solar roadways, Amazon drones, flying cars, you name it, every solution that you could possibly ever want to have. And our lives are going to be like this, where we drive around in self-driving cars backwards, seemingly, I don't know why, and wearing cashmere, because now we have so much time to go and buy our lovely cashmere jumpers. But, sort of like to what end, I guess, and how do we connect some of these solutions into what the world still really looks like, which is very crowded transport networks. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that demand for transport's continuing to rise on a per capita basis in many parts of the world. So it's not like the arrival of video conferencing, everyone said we're going to travel less. That's not actually turning out to be true. And Trisha's here from the DFT, and she'll know all about that. Severance, still a fact of life. This is LA, but there's lots of other places where we're seeing still, severe congestion, severance, motorways that are cutting communities apart in cities. Our own Hammersmith flyover is a great example of that. Absolute blight in the center of a town. Road safety black spots like Old Street Roundabout. Pollution. And, a place that was enabled by transport, Canary Wharf, is right next door to the most deprived ward in the country. And you could argue that problem's been created by transport rather than, solved by transport. So I think all that flying car stuff is, questionable how much impact it's had or is going to have anytime soon. And we need to also do more, not just fix all of those problems, but we know that we can create jobs through building transport, regenerate neighborhoods, create new places in the city like King's Cross just around the corner from here, create little places in the city at a smaller scale, which are pockets for communities. This is the allotment gardens that were built while King's Cross was being redeveloped. So there's some quite, really meaningful but small-scale things that transport can do as well. And also think, not just beyond the station, but under the ground as well. This is a project that we're working on in Singapore, and Singapore has to think three-dimensionally, but something which London and many other cities haven't really had to think about. So there's huge amounts of further positive opportunity and upside. So how can we use the disruption that's happening, which is real, but how can we harness that to actually deliver better outcomes, not just in transport, but for cities and for communities? And I've just put down 6 thoughts that I've got, and you'll have many more than that, so we can discuss that in the Q&A. I've now learned to number my points, because then when people fall asleep, it's like, oh, we're on point number 3. So you can keep track of where we are. So I think the first thing I wanted to say was, there's been a real shift in the industry from a focus on the actual transport itself, which the biggest problem in the transport industry is that everyone in the transport industry loves to talk about transport, which most people are not that interested in. They just want to get to where they're going and do whatever it is that they want to do. And there has been a change, in my view, in the tenor in the industry, also around the world, about what is transport here to do and what can it actually unlock. So when you talk about transport, people in the transport industry like to talk about things like this, HS2, the fourth crossing, which ARUP was involved in building. There's nothing wrong with that. But actually what's happening in cities is some really very severe issues around lack of housing, deprived areas, brownfield sites in the center of the city, lack of access to employment. And even in a place like LA, where people voted a measure through in LA, the good kind of referendum, so 75% of people voted for an extra charge on the sales tax to collect $120 billion to pay for new transport, to fundamentally change how LA moves. But when those railways are now being proposed and rolled out, people are saying, hang on a second, we don't want any change to our community. So what we might have called regeneration, people see as gentrification, as community displacement. So even where we do have funding, we do have the opportunity to bring transport to solve some of these problems, people aren't seeing it that way. They're seeing it as a negative. And the $120 billion that's been collected can't be spent quickly enough at the moment because of that. So 3 examples of projects where this has actually sort of happened in a positive way is, for example, Barking Riverside, which is a project out in East London that I was involved with back in the GLA days. So this is a transport project, but actually it's a housing project. You'd never build a railway line to a swamp to serve a bunch of frogs. You're doing it because you're trying to unlock this massive development site that has not ever come off the ground. So that's good, because it means that through transport spending, we can actually unlock and solve other problems within the city. Barking Riverside is another great example of that. Battersea is another great example of that, the extension of the Northern Line, and the Bakerloo Line extension in London as well, which is going to an area over here, which is one of the kind of more deprived parts of the city. And the whole case for that isn't really a transport case, ultimately, politically. It's about regeneration, housing creation, et cetera. So the tone of discussions around transport infrastructure, in my experience, is really changing. So what does that mean? That means we can build more transport infrastructure, which is maybe a good thing, but we can build better transport infrastructure that's also delivering things other than just moving people from A to B. So secondly, I was going to talk about, provider pays to the beneficiary pays. What I mean by this is, when I worked at Transport for London, everybody had this on their bulletin board, and the massive capital program, and it's all being delivered by the public sector, and that's really comfortable because we trust ourselves and we know that we're going to do this amazing stuff and it's all going to go great. But actually now there's a big issue around funding, and there's not enough funding in the public sector around the world to pay for all of these things. So there's a bit of a sort of back to the future where when you think about how the underground was originally developed, it's entirely private sector and very much linked to the development. So the whole idea was that the money was going to be made through getting people to move out to the suburbs and buy homes. So how is that now playing out? Just a few examples. Bristol Temple Meads Station, so anyone who's been there, it's sort of unbelievable that that's the center of Bristol in some ways. And there's the station there, and it is not very attractive. Everyone agrees it should change. Network Rail wants it to change. The university wants it to change. The city wants it to change. Nobody's got enough money to pay for it. But together, they might be able to pay for it. And so more and more, you're seeing multiple parties coming together to pay for transport infrastructure in new ways. That requires new skills in the industry. It requires new funding models. It requires new individuals who are able to kind of draw some of this together. Another example from San Francisco is Trans-Bay Terminal, which is a $4 billion project which has been funded through a fantastic combination of oversight development, public land sales, a tax increment financing zone around the terminal, and actually they've taken some of the bridge tolls as well to pay for it. So a sort of layer cake of all different funding streams. But that's very different from the way we've traditionally thought about how we want to pay for transport infrastructure. But that's going to unlock not only all sorts of new projects like this one, which is the Parramatta line in Sydney, where there's an opportunity to connect the city westwards, but there's the Olympic Park that can be redeveloped, a new business district, and the sort of Shoreditch of Sydney, which is going to change quite dramatically as part of that. East-West Rail is another great example. There's been a discussion about unlocking 1 million homes. We've done some work to show that, yes, we can actually deliver the 1 million homes, and the scheme could pay for itself as well, with some small contribution from the public sector. So this is an amazing opportunity for us to not just bring other parties in and get beneficiaries to pay for the infrastructure, but also to deliver something that's more fit for purpose for the beneficiaries. Because when you're paying for something, you want to make sure that you're designing it in the way that's going to work for you. The third area I was going to mention was around data, and we're doing a huge amount of work on this where I work at the moment. And, with apologies to people who actually know something about transport modeling, I'll try and explain a little bit at a very high level how transport modeling and transport planning works at the moment. For example, if we wanted to understand how people are going to move around a station or move around a station today. And the year I was born, 1971, a guy called Fruin came up with all of these ideas about how people moved around stations. And basically, nobody has questioned this since then. Obviously, I'm slightly overstating the case, but this is how we understand pedestrian movement through transport terminals, and it's got many limitations. It over-aggregates individuals. It doesn't understand how crowds move through spaces very well. But fundamentally, why would you use this when you can start to use real data like this, where we can actually look how people are moving through stations and develop machine learning algorithms that actually understand real movement in real locations and start to derive how that location needs to be designed in order to best accommodate the particular preferences of the users of that station. The other example I was going to give on this was the cycle superhighway program that I was involved with when I was at the GLA. So, kind of sounds simple. You want to build a cycle lane. How hard could that possibly be? You need to know how many people are cycling and how many more people you think might cycle in order to justify the infrastructure. And the problem is, and we don't have to go through this in any detail, but fundamentally, the way transport modeling works at the moment is very aggregated. So it takes a bunch of homes and a bunch of businesses. It sort of broadly allocates how people are going to move between those two. It then says how you're going to move by mode, and it then decides what trip assignment you're going to have. Now, obviously, gross oversimplification, but broadly, this is the approach. That doesn't echo any decision-making process that probably you or I would recognize. And so one of the problems is that, this four-step idea, the reality is much more complicated. There are problems like when you go walk to the tube, take the tube, and then walk to work. This bit never happened, and that bit sort of never happened either. It broadly ignores walking and cycling, short trips. And it takes a whole load of information, shrinks it down to a very small sampled group, and then grosses it back up again. Now, that's fine when you don't have anything better out there, and there's other problems that I won't go into. But fundamentally, surely we can do better nowadays than clickers, which are giving us, indices like this. And when we started on the cycling program, there were 75 junctions out of 5,000 on the TfL network. Where we were counting cyclists a couple of times a year using clickers. So the idea that you could build up a clear picture of how people are cycling in the city, justify any kind of investment, is absurd. And then, especially when you consider the political opposition to a lot of these plans. So obviously, at the most basic level, you can start to count cyclists, and this is in the center of Copenhagen. And at one level, that's simple, but even getting that, put in place is quite difficult and challenging. And this is one of the things that we've developed within ARUP, but it's just to illuminate the fact that what we don't have, and what this app does, is collecting information about individuals over time. So what Google knows is not just that you took an oyster trip or that a car drove into the congestion charging zone. It knows every mode that you took across the day, across the week, across your lifetime. And as transport decision makers, we all would love to know that, and we need to know that to design better infrastructure for our cities, for our passengers, for our communities. And so big data is creating these huge opportunities, but we don't hold the data as decision makers, whether that's the private sector or the public sector. How can we start to collect that data in a more structured way and make better decisions? So fundamentally, the opportunities that opens up are very significant and opens up policy making moving forward in areas such as road charging, where politically it's very difficult to argue about road charging because we don't actually know that car and that oyster trip are not connected, let alone walking and cycling. So how can we actually connect all of these behaviors together and start to understand how people could change their behavior, how people do change their behavior, and actually what people want to do and how we can enable that through something like road pricing, rather than seeing it as something really scary that we couldn't possibly talk to the public about. Fourth point is around infrastructure. So when you talk to people in transport, this is like the best thing that could ever happen, right? So a fixed piece of infrastructure that, never changes. And, it's really great that people still celebrate it. And if we can build it for 500 years, that's a lot better than 200 years. I mean, I'm slightly stereotyping, but it does attract a lot of people who feel like that. And they have a love for the infrastructure that's being built. And we have this idea that, people kind of commute into work every day and then they commute back out again. And that's not really quite as true as it was before either anymore. So both the people and the infrastructure needs are changing. So whether you're talking about the uptake of driverless cars, where, estimates range from sort of, 20% by 2050 to 100% by 2050. If you're Highways England, how do you actually think about that huge variation in behaviors, let alone how people change their behaviors from day to day when they're moving around the network? So for me, where we need to move as an industry is much more where the property developer industry is going. And this is just one example from Canada Water, which is being developed by British Land under the sort of supervision of Roger Maitland, who was responsible for King's Cross. And what's really interesting when you look at this development, it's a very modular floor plate. So the whole idea is that all the buildings can be student accommodation, then they can be a restaurant, they can be a gym, they can be elder accommodation, they can be, something designed for artists. But the idea is that the development flexes and changes over time. And that's not the way we think about transport infrastructure. We think about it as broadly, as fixed, and being fixed is a good thing. So how do we start to introduce some of this sort of thinking into transport infrastructure, whether that's building things that are a bit more temporary and flexible, like the cycle lane on Royal College Street, or whether it's a more day-to-day change, like the zipper lane on the Golden Gate Bridge, which changes with tidal flow, or the flex curbs that ARUP's developed, which is around, differential use of curb space over the course of the day. So this is the kind of thinking that's starting to come into the industry, but it's quite alien for the industry. And that's going to maybe good in and of itself, but more importantly, it creates more capacity in the system, and we can make a system that's fit for purpose. It can be used in the right way at different times of day by different people. So there's a big change for the public sector as well, as I see it, especially city agencies, from being deliverers of service to sort of being the conductor of the orchestra and taking quite an active role as policymakers in a way that they maybe aren't used to at the moment. So if I look at London, you've got the kind of publicly owned and operated network, like the Tube network. You've got kind of franchise networks. Then you've got the stuff that, we don't really get involved with, cars, bicycles. And then you've got the licensed industries. That's all been pretty established for a long time. And what's happened is that first, the rise of things like Uber, Lyft, and the list goes on. But at least that was still a bit comfortable. It was in the, although it was uncomfortable politically, it was comfortable, like we know what this is, it's a minicab. And now all of a sudden we've got this sort of explosion of weird and wacky new things, whether that's City Mapper's decision to introduce a bus route because they didn't think that the London bus routes were covering the particular problem that they saw, the Bird electric scooters. So what are those? Are those, how do we license those under this regime? The dockless bikes, do we like those? Do we not like those? TfL spent several years, agonizing about that question. Car sharing, Uber Pop, Uber Pool, forget about the drones and the driverless cars. So what's happened is that city agencies around the world are really on the back foot responding to all these different things and not able to get onto the front foot and shape things because they're still, for those of you who've seen WALL-E, trying to decide whether the spork is a spoon or a fork. And it's incredibly time-consuming for these agencies to reflect on this, come up with the right policy framework, and decide how they want to classify the sporks that are coming into the system, having never had a piece of spork legislation previously. And so for me, fundamentally, and you can see some of the good regulators and good city decision makers moving in this direction, it's about linking all of that back to what are the problems that we're trying to solve as a city. So if we just take an example of air pollution in London, how can we use all of those technologies to deliver cleaner buses, like the electric buses? How can we actually use regulation actively to do things like require the new taxis in London to be zero emission? Or things like Madrid, where the car sharing companies came and they said, we want to have car sharing in Madrid, please can we have some curb space? And Madrid said, that's fine, but you have to use electric cars. And they said, oh, we can't, doesn't work. And so, fine, no car sharing. So surprise, surprise, the car sharing company figured out how to get the electric cars to work after all. And that's a position that cities aren't really accustomed to and also not geared up to do. They don't have the volume of people to do that kind of work. And maybe they don't have the kind of muscularity that they will need in this environment. And that's not negative. That's just a fact of life. So when you look at something like car sharing in New York, where do you want car sharing in New York? Do you want it in Manhattan, where all of the public transport is, or do you want it out here, where I grew up, where it's pretty difficult to get to public transport? So this is where cities are going to have to be using cordons, pricing, incentives, whatever you want to call it. But that's a stance where they haven't quite got there yet. But in my view, that is where we're going to end up. And that isn't, again, it isn't a bad thing. It's simply a fact of life that cities are going to get comfortable with the idea of sort of orchestrating this 1,000 flowers blooming and all the opportunities that are coming up and actually harnessing those opportunities for the outcomes that cities need to deliver and want to deliver. And finally, I was going to talk a bit about stakeholder engagement, which is one of my pet peeves. So, when I was at City Hall, we used to have to go out and convince people about various things that we wanted to do using things like this. We're like, look, Vauxhall gyratory, it's going to be amazing. And nobody can understand this or make head or tail of it. It's certainly not very inspiring. And it also looks like we've probably decided it all already, and we don't really care what your opinion is. And people react accordingly. They don't react in a positive way, and quite rightly so. So just going to talk very briefly about in a very potted history, our experience on the cycle superhighways, where we're like, we have the right answer, here are the cycle superhighways, they're very logical, it's a brilliant plan, and then they weren't very super when we brought them in. They were, Erica's here, she'll remember all of this. It was paint on the road, and then the paint would stop, and where were you supposed to go? And rightly, we were castigated about this. But the problem was that we didn't know how to build a good cycle lane because we'd never really built one before. And then we had this really, massive outpouring of political anger and frustration because, the mayor had come in saying he really cared about cycling, he was going to do something about cycle safety, and it wasn't working. And we had massive, die-ins like this one. And then what happened was we discovered that people online and sort of enthusiasts in London, some of whom were bloggers, some of whom were just, random guys in their bedrooms, were coming up with really good designs that were much better than the designs that we were coming up with. And by opening ourselves up to that, which was quite difficult, I think, emotionally for Transport for London, for City Hall, we were able to then start to really design some better things and learn from what people out there had to say, whether that was the low-level cycle lights, which had never been approved in this country previously, although they were used on the continent, floating bus stops, And that allowed us to deliver much higher quality infrastructure ultimately. And for me, it was incredibly eye-opening about, the whole kind of rise of social media is seen by large institutions and, broadly speaking, by, government as one of those large institutions as a negative thing, right? It's threatening. Who knows what all those people out there are saying? And you put some bit.ly link up on Twitter, that's your press release. So did you do it? Have you engaged with social media? And that's not really, the way that we need to be using this. We need to be tapping into the understanding and the enthusiasm and the activism and the negativity that's out there to help to shape better solutions ultimately and get things delivered. Because by tapping into that groundswell of opinion, we were able to then use that as political support to get the superhighways in, whether you like them or not. But, they were built, and that was partly because of the way that we engaged with the public and lobbyists, enthusiasts, et cetera, through the forum of social media. And if we take that even further, just one example is the Luchtzeil Bridge in Rotterdam, which is entirely come up with by the public and crowdfunded by the public. If you paid for it, you would get your name on one of those boards. So what's the kind of untapped potential of some of this? And how can we, as a decision-making community in transport, stop being afraid of it and start to actually harness it for good, both in terms of the quality of the thinking, in terms of the political groundswell, and that's quite an art that is something that is going to be a journey for transport decision makers, private sector and public sector. So those are my thoughts, but I know you all have a lot of thoughts. I can see that you do. So let's have the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Isabel, for a great romp through provocations. So I think there's a lot of thoughts in there for people to tackle, from the hegemony of transport modelling to what autonomous vehicles might be like and what they might be doing. So very happy to open up some questions from the audience to provoke some more.
Or comments.
Oh, they could comment too,
Yeah.
but we'd prefer it to be provocative.
Well, a comment can be provocative.
Peter.
Okay, thank you. Peter Jones, you very much is what I thought that was really great summary of the sort of issues and where we're moving, and I agree with all that, so I thought it was fantastic. I'm just wondering, over how much of the globe do you think actually that's the way thinking's going? Is it pretty universal, or is it quite small pockets? Based on your experience now, I'd be interested to know.
I think the upshot of all of this, to me, is that sort of decision makers, which could be public or private, but if you look at sort of urban ecosystem of decision making, are on the back foot about a lot of this stuff, whether that's new funding models. Is that working? Yeah. Whether that's new funding models, whether that's data, whether that's the rise of new business models, and how do we respond to that? And that's even true in the bigger, more capable cities. So the risk is that a lot of the opportunity from these technologies, new business models, and approaches gets lost, because the easiest thing to do is just say, okay, we'll just ban those things because we don't know what they are, or we'll just tell people we can't have this infrastructure because we can't afford it. So how do we kind of start to create some best practice examples, a community of people who know how to do this? But those people are very thin on the ground. I mean, when you look at most people making decisions in transport, just take one example, how many of them actually understand anything about data, cloud computing, social media? I mean, less than 1%, right? And they're not that interested in it either. So how do we actually unlock, some of the younger community in the industry and somehow empower them or draw them through the system to start to open up some of that opportunity is a really interesting challenge. Even within, where I work, it's a really big challenge for all of us, I think.
Thanks. Robin Hickman from the Bartlett School of Planning. Do you think the way that some of the major development areas in London, I'm thinking of Battersea, Nine Elms, have been developed using the developers to fund the infrastructure leads to a high quality of development? It can lead to high cost affordability issues, that then are ploughed back into the infrastructure, but it leads to affordability problems.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think, as with many things, it's all about how you do it, isn't it? It's not that it's intrinsically a bad approach. It's about how well does the public sector contract with the private sector. So in the case of Battersea, there's been cost overruns because, basically we were pushed around by the developer, maybe weren't assertive enough and didn't have the right clauses in the contract to say, well, actually, sorry, you already said that was what you're going to do, so now you owe us some money. Instead, we kind of paid them some money, right? So that's just basic commercial nous, which isn't often, there's not very much of that in the public sector, or not that type of commercial nous around development. But you can have a counterexample like the Crossrail station at Canary Wharf, which was cheaper delivered through the private sector than it would have been delivered through the public sector. So there's a real mixed bag out there. I just think we have to get this right as an industry and as, I guess for the policy-making community, because there isn't enough money out there in the public purse, not just in this country but elsewhere, to do all the things that we want to do. So unless we can start to tap into all of the upside, which typically ends up in somebody else's pocket, and harness that, we're just missing a huge trick. And it will be quite painful on the way because there are so few people on the public sector side who know how to do that kind of thing. Rightly so, because they've not, worked in commercial property development previously, for example. So I'm interested in how we kind of develop a cadre of people that are able to do this sort of thing. If you look at the MTA in New York, they've actually split the capital project side from the operations side, and the guy who runs the capital project side is a former commercial property developer, quite a big, sort of senior guy in the industry, and they've done that deliberately to try and get that now into the public sector side. So I think that's just going to be the way we're going to have to go, but with some probably quite rocky road, as you say.
Thank you. Thank you for a very provocative series of points. Your last point makes me think, and in relation to Peter's question, sorry, I'm Julio Eola from Development Planning Unit here in UCL, that whilst you're trying to cope in a city like London with a much more diversified offer in the way of dockless bikes and car sharing and so on, cities in the so-called developing world have been grappling with a very large informal sector that supplies transport, particularly to the poor, in the form of tuk-tuks or rickshaws or minibuses or whatever local name there is for different forms of motorized and non-motorized transport. And what is happening there is they're trying to actually control everything by centralizing it, whereas here the movement in a city like London is the opposite, is more, as you described, is a move away from a central supply of the service. So I'll be curious to know what you're, from ARUP now, not wearing your hat as former London deputy mayor, but how do you see this tension resolving? And where do you see that going? You may not be familiar with the cities that I'm referring to, so in which case it's a bit unfair. But
No, it's a bit like the whole discussion around mobile phone technology leapfrogging landline rollout, right? So what's happening is that those cities are perhaps looking to the more developed cities and saying, okay, now what we need to do, because when you look at all of those different modes of transport, most of them started off private and then were slowly regulated and then taken over. So there was an absorption over many, many decades into the public sector. And that's sort of seen as the received wisdom of what the path should be, as opposed to could those cities become actually more beacons for places like London about how you use that groundswell of more grassroots provided technology and business models to do exactly what it is that the Western world needs to do, let's say. So I was talking to the guy who runs Ola Cabs, which is the third biggest car sharing company in the world, but they run buses, taxis, scooters, you name it. They've got it. So they're kind of a much more diverse Uber, let's say, but all under one roof. So what you wouldn't want to do is regulate somebody like that heavily. You want to use that entrepreneurial spirit and kind of unlock that and empower that. But I'm not seeing that kind of thinking really anywhere at the moment. And I think everybody is still very much on the back foot. Talking to somebody at TfL the other day about the Bird electric scooters, which have just been licensed to be used in the Olympic Park, and just the toing and froing and drama about under what piece of regulation are we going to regulate these things? Do they need to be regulated? You can imagine, and it's unfortunately that's just a necessity of being a regulator. But when you're spending all your time doing all of that, you don't have any time to think about how might I use car sharing to tackle pockets of poor access to public transport. So you see, New York's doing a piece of work on that at the moment, but there's some bits and pieces here and there, but nobody's really got it nailed yet at all. I think we're quite a few years away from that. But the DFT's got it sorted.
Do you have any thoughts on prisoner transport?
I'm sorry?
Any thoughts on prisoner transport?
On the sorry?
Prisoner transport, transporting prisoners. Prisoners.
Oh, transport of prisoners?
Yes.
No. Do you have any thoughts on that? What did you have in mind?
Risks associated with it.
That's interesting. I need to think about that. By the end of the Q&A, I will have something clever to say about that. Or not.
Thanks. My name's John Cartledge. I used to work in transport consumerism in London. Thinking about, for example, in this country, the Department for Transport, which is not universally regarded as the brightest star in the Whitehall constellation. And it's certainly characterised by extremely rapid turnover, both of its ministers and of its civil servants, most of whom seem bent on getting out of that into other departments as quickly as opportunity arises. Or thinking about transport policy making at the city level in London, where there is, as it were, constant tension between the objectives at City Hall and the 32, 33 boroughs with their own agendas, which don't necessarily align, and the very limited financial resources that the mayor has in, as it were, independent means of access to funding for anything that he or she might want to do or to procure. And the huge political tensions generated by issues around, shall we say, road pricing, where clearly the view of the public is one, the view of the professionals is something else, and there's a mismatch between the two. Do you think we are helped or hindered by our political institutions in making progress in the kind of directions that you would like to see?
There's a lot in there. First of all, I need to say I think the current leadership at the DFT is excellent, of which we have some representation here. But I think one of the problems is that transport isn't exactly the glamorous thing that you want from a ministerial perspective, and that's because it's all about, train tracks and bridges, and for a lot of people, I don't think politically that's that appealing, as opposed to building homes, helping people get their kids into school, that's more politically emotive, let's say. So actually kind of increasingly recasting transport, which there is quite a lot of stuff afoot within government, as the unlocker of homes, as the, tackler of social equity issues. I think we'll change that over time and make it a more appealing portfolio, because I agree with you. Fundamentally, when you talk about the complexity point, everywhere I go in the world now, everyone goes like, Isabel, you don't understand. Our city, it's so complicated. We have 3 levels of government. Sometimes they say 4. But it's the same everywhere, really. It just takes all different forms everywhere. And I guess life is complex. Large institutions, private institutions are complex. And I know this is very simplistic, but it is true that leadership and focus on 3 or 4 things that you're going to achieve, you can cut through almost anything with tenacity, perseverance, determination, and taking leadership. So I think sometimes there's just a lack of leadership on some of these subjects, including maybe road pricing, where I think somebody needs to be convinced that, why can't we design road charging that people will they'll look at it and they'll say, thank goodness, somebody's finally come up with this. And I think that's doable, because it's a complete pain when you drive around London, which obviously I would never do, because being a progressive person. But, 33 different parking regimes, Blackwall Tunnel, low emission zone, congestion charge, God forbid you should come from outside London, you'd be terrified by all of these potential charges and penalty notices. So, something that just starts to integrate all of that, explain how the heck you're going to get from A to B, give you the opportunity and upside to, win extra points if you take your bicycle from time to time. Whatever it is, I mean, it's worth a much longer conversation. But fundamentally, having worked in a political environment for quite a long time, there is a road charging scheme that can do that. And so I think as a policy-making community, let's say, it behooves us to try and come up with that, especially considering the opportunity that data and mobile phones are now giving us to, if you were Uber, Deliveroo, Amazon, Lyft, you wouldn't be thinking about this as a poison chalice, you'd be thinking of it as an opportunity. So maybe, that's where some of that leadership may come from somewhere quite unexpected in this particular case. But, I mean, coming back to your basic point, I do think that quite a lot can get done, but you do have to also be cognizant of surfing the wave of politics, right? And just accepting sometimes that one has to go with whatever's the political thing du jour, but then jump onto that to deliver whatever the big thing is that we want to deliver.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. Lee Wan from Cambridge. You mentioned this shrinking budget for the local authorities investing on transport. Yes, this transport used to be a game for the giants. Even they have very little budget, they will spend the money on technology, mainly collecting data, deploying sensors on street. Do you think that local authorities deploying sensors, collecting data is an effort in vain, given that Google has already got this much of data? And my second question is that if you do believe that the local government should collect their own data, what suggestions can you give to these local authorities in order to enable them to make full use of this data, given that people have been criticizing there's not enough skills, not the right personnel in the at the local government level? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So message of hope, I think if I look at some of the clients that we work with, if you just have 3 or 4 good people in-house that can think about these questions, then, that's enough, right? So they don't need a team of 50 people. They just need a few people who can make some intelligent decisions. So that's one thing. Having spent a huge amount of time looking at lots and lots of different people's data over the last 1.5 to 2 years, whether that's mobile phone providers, Citymapper and other apps, talking to Google, my considered view is that absolutely we need to be in the business of collecting data, unfortunately, and creating new data streams, because the problem is, first of all, everybody's currently in that mode of like, I've got some data, it's worth $1 zillion, right? And like, it's amazing data. Just wait till you see it. Right? I mean, you have ridiculous discussions with people who have quite mediocre data, and then you can't combine it with other data sources. So frankly, where we're going now is saying to clients, you just collect it, at source. So if you're a big transport terminal using Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, infrared cameras, there's so many technologies that are not that hard to deploy, and actually collecting it yourself is the better way to go, which is unfortunate because it all already exists, but, that's just the way of the world. It's too difficult to try and stitch together what's out there already at the moment. I mean, I think over time, actually, my view is that all of that stuff will become more regulated and more brought into the public sector, which you're sort of already seeing a little bit of with Facebook and all of these sorts of things. And that might make it easier. But for now, if you're the city, local authority, transport operator, just whack up some, detectors, have some, machine learning algorithms in the background, use some agent-based models, all that kind of stuff, and just do it yourself.
Cheers. Hi, Andrew Hugo from CIHT. I was interested in your the beneficiary should pay, and just turning that on its head a bit. Does that mean that the people who will benefit are the people who can afford to pay, and the people who disbenefit are the people who can't? And is that a right consequence if we follow that?
Yeah, if I get you right there, I think there is. My view is that the whole question of equity and the impact of transport on society, not in the broadest sense, but on social equity, displacement, connectivity for impoverished communities is, well, my personal opinion is that this has been something transport, just like nothing to do with us. Don't want to know, never thought about it, don't care. Vaguely, I say something in my annual report to make it sound like I care, right? And that's partly because it's quite hard to quantify, and in a highly analytical industry, it's like, how do I put a number on that? I don't really know, so I just pretend it didn't happen. Because of I think even the sort of Brexit, Trump phenomena is causing a lot of, certainly cities around the world, to suddenly sit up and say, hang on, we need to think about that. So if you go to LA and you talk to the guy who runs the transit agency there, the first issue, the most important issue that he's concerned about is that stuff around gentrification, not displacing communities, even more than figuring out how to get the traffic to move around the city, right? So that's great, because that means that we can finally try and design transport infrastructure that not only doesn't have a negative social impact, but actually is a positive one. But this is completely, in my simplistic view, uncharted territory for transport. I don't care what, somebody says somewhere. That's been my experience, is that it's just absolutely not at the heart of any decision making, or even, it's certainly somewhere far behind environment, which is already very, very much behind a lot of other things.
Thank you. The transport transport in London is that exactly, and ironically, may transport live long. It's very funny, As you know, in morning and the evening time, the rush hour, so crowded. Also, so scarce. How can government tackling already tens of years past, but nothing any improved. And then, secondly, the street is just so narrow. Why don't you make, put the bridge? So it's very useful if you make put the bridge, people can, it's not so crowded, It's very, tension also, how can you sort it out, the two kind of the problems?
Street crowd. You're particularly talking about roads and streets and crowding them, the competition for space as well. Yeah. So fundamentally, I think we don't use the capacity that we have well at all. So we design for the peaks, right, and then for the morning peak, and then the whole rest of the time, who knows? Who cares what's happening? So that can't be the right answer. We don't use space on the road network flexibly. Right, so we just say, okay, the bus lane is from this time until this time. Is that the right time? Who knows? We put the sign up 5 years ago, too hard to change it. Right, so how can we now use sort of the rise of digital technologies as a way of flexing the system and almost getting it to move depending on demand, and get people to move depending on demand as well? We don't give people very good information about when what is busy and what your alternatives might be, and we could be much more proactive on that. So I do think we're not even using what we have at the moment very well at all. It is really interesting when you go to East Asia and you see the cities there, and there's people on all different levels, and in this city that's not considered to be acceptable because of the way that it looks in terms of the public realm. And I remember there was a discussion about Oxford Street, and should there be a level on Oxford Street, right, where you have all the buses down here and all the people up here. And, this city isn't in that space at the moment because it's seen as a sort of blight on placemaking. But, at a mathematical level, that's true. Or you look at a lot of Chinese cities bringing monorails in, that would never happen in Europe because people think they're too ugly, because it's blighting the urban landscape. So whether that's rational or not, but that's the mood music, I guess, in this environment.
Hi. I've got so many questions to ask, I don't know which one to ask.
Just fold them all into one, mega question.
It would be too much. I have a different stance than most people I speak to about electric vehicles. I don't think they are good for our planet. What's your opinion on this?
My not only opinion, but my informed knowledge on this is that from an air pollution perspective, which is all about exposure, right? they are radically better than everything else we've got out there at the moment, right? Because they're not emitting anything. So the exposure to any pollution in terms of the urban urban community is, basically nil, let's just say, overgeneralizing there, but broadly. Yes, there's a carbon impact, but even that is significantly lower than the carbon impact of petrol and diesel vehicles, even with the grid as it is, and then we can hope that our grid's going to decarbonize over time. It's not going to get worse, let's assume. So on that basis, I would say it's absolutely the best thing to do, and it's also a technology that exists, because waiting for all these technologies that are going to be perfect and, like hydrogen vehicles, which are not affordable and not going to be affordable anytime soon, certainly not for private vehicles. There's not enough grasping of the current opportunities around technologies. So, there's so many technologies that we could use today to decarbonize, cut pollution, all those sorts of things, increase road safety. Why are they not being deployed onto the network everywhere, all around the world? Driverless cars, all we do is talk about, the Google self-driving car. Why do we not have intelligent speed adaptation on every bus in the world? Why do we not have pedestrian and cyclist detection on every public fleet vehicle in the world? It's shameful. It's wrong. And meanwhile, the tech community are just, getting really excited about their one car. There's something very skewed and wrong about that. And that's, again, where I think, policymakers as a community need to be bringing some of that into the urban environment and beyond. It's not working.
Robert Stauskas from City Air Technologies. My question to you is, obviously these policies relate to pollution. How long do you think it would take before there's a meaningful drop in pollution as a result of these policies? And also, are there any other cities in the world that you mirror, that you'd like to mirror in terms of their achievement?
Yeah, in terms of pollution, specifically on the second point. So I spent a lot of time when I was at City Hall working on this, and we're doing a lot of work on it now. I think that there's one very simple point I would make, which is every city. So what happens is, people are shouting at me about pollution. What should I do? Right. Oh, I heard this guy did something, and okay, right, we'll just do that, and throw that against the wall, and hopefully all those people that are shouting about pollution will go away. I mean, I'm overstating the case somewhat, but not much. So where is, and there's a lot of high quality thinking around air quality measurement, but where is the kind of air policy toolkit where I could say, in my old job, right, I could say, right, okay, these are the 25 things that everybody's tried. What works, what doesn't work, when does it work, and that you can systematically look at that and figure out what the right combination of interventions is for your city. So there's some cities that are getting it, let's say, more right, maybe Paris. Actually, London's doing loads more than most cities around the world. That doesn't mean that London's doing enough. But, you go to New York, it's like pollution doesn't exist. They put all the monitors on the top of the buildings, which is obviously the best place to put them if you wanted to say you had a very clean city. And a lot of cities do that. And obviously, if we had been smart enough, we could have done that in London. And nobody could ever have said there was any pollution in London, But that's what goes on in most places in the world. So I would say the level of sophistication in policymaking on pollution is very low. And it's very bitty as well, right? There aren't people who have looked at the whole kind of panoply of the publicly owned fleets, local interventions like we were talking about before on local corridors, taxi regulation. You want to drive your taxi in the city, it needs to be zero emission. The list goes on, right? But you want to be looking at the whole thing, not just as long as I've ticked 3 or 4 boxes, I've probably done enough here. I actually think London is probably one of the best in the world on this. But, obviously Simon Burkett will have a different view on that. Well, no, but for the range of things that are being delivered, I think, you don't have a low emission zone in most other places. Well, anywhere else, really.
I'm going to suggest we continue the discussion downstairs with one.
We have one more question from Tricia, who's been trying to ask a question for a while. Right. Sorry. I think you were just the most persistent in putting your hand up. So,
Thank you, Isabel. It's fantastic as ever. I'm Tricia Hayes from the Department for Transport. 31 years and counting, just for the gentleman at the back. We are amazing. I want some help, Isabel, and I can't afford to pay you, so I'm just going to ask you in a public forum. In my 31 years, one of the things that's really annoyed me the most is how obsessed our cities are with rail. You give a city a few quid to do something really exciting, and they throw it into a development fund to try and get a rail scheme to grip 3 or something. I love a bus. I would really like to find a way to encourage cities to get buses more integrated into their thinking about the future. Buses are flexible, buses are people-friendly, buses can be green. What's your advice on how to do that?
Right. So I think this sort of goes back to the weird obsession in transport with big physical infrastructure. And I felt that there was a change within the transport community in London on cycling when we had cycle hire, because it was big bits of kit that we dug into the road involving jackhammers, large bits of metal, etc. So everyone was like, oh, this is like a serious mode of transport because it involves large volumes of digging things. I'm not, and you know this, so I'm not kidding. There was a real detectable change. Given that, what I'm trying to do at the moment is there's a weird thing when you go to cities, right? We've gotten to a certain size, and now we're too good for buses. We have to have something on rails. But it doesn't matter that the rail thing could carry fewer people than the bus thing, because it's on rubber wheels. That's not good. And the thing on metal wheels is really good. So what we've tried to do, and it's not very well understood within the industry, like all these different technologies, what even are they, and how many people can they carry in each direction, under what configuration? So we're doing some work in Cambridge at the moment, looking at what the mayor said he wants to have a metro for Cambridge, and everybody laughs because Cambridge is small and they don't deserve to have a metro. But what do we even mean by a metro, right? So we want a high capacity system that's affordable for the city, and which is going to have a real impact on congestion. And so what we've tried to do as part of that work is to kind of take all the different technologies and map them based on how many people they can carry, and basically show that there's a massive blurring across all of these things. And there are some interesting new technologies that are starting to, you'll know this, that open this up, like the optically guided trams that function like trams but don't require rails, so you don't have to dig a hole in the ground. So hopefully those feel enough like rail trams that people feel they're doing something meaningful from a digging holes perspective. But that's the only advice I can give you, because I agree with you. It's very frustrating. And so we've used this sort of chart with a lot of different cities now, and it does help because it's kind of, the Paris Metro runs on rubber wheels. So what's that, a guided bus? It's all just a total nonsense. There you go. You see? So that's what I said. Right. It's like this isn't. So the word metro is very powerful, even if it's a bus.
With that, being a great fan of buses, I think let's draw this to a close. Thank you very, very much for a fantastic presentation.